Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This episode is sponsored by the MA in Critical Studies program at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. The Critical Studies program produces creative, critical thinkers with the research, writing, and communication skills necessary to address pressing issues at the intersection of cultural production and critical theory. MA program applications are open now, and for more information, you can go to pnca.edu/critical studies. This is episode 82, and my guest today is Jessica Nydia Pabón-Colón. Jessica is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at SUNY New Paltz, as well as the author of the book Graffiti Girls, Performing Feminism in the Hip-Hop Diaspora. She's an interdisciplinary Latina feminist performance studies scholar working at the intersections of women's gender and sexuality studies, cultural studies, Black and Latinx studies, and performance studies. Jessica's research fuels her arts-based community activism. She's curated gallery shows and coordinated public mural productions with Graffiti Girls, published opinion pieces in graffiti magazines such as the Infamous magazine, lectured at community events like Wall Therapy in Rochester, New York, moderated discussions including Art in Public at the O Positive Festival in Kingston, New York, and appeared on Radio Kingston to discuss feminist activism at the women's marches as well as women and deviance more broadly. In our conversation, Jessica and I chat about how women graffiti artists perform feminism on the global stage, who is excluded from the quote-unquote respectable street art model espoused by large creative cities, what a feminist approach to arts curating looks like on the ground, and why building feminist, queer, and decolonial bonds across the Puerto Rican diaspora is key to how Jessica imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Cathy. It's my pleasure to be here.
I'd love to start talking about your fabulous book, Graffiti Girls, Performing Feminism in the Hip-Hop Diaspora, which is such a fun and smart book. Can you give our listeners a little bit of a sense of what that book covers?
Thank you. Fun and smart. That's a great combination of things. So Graffiti Girls is a transnational ethnography that uses a queer feminist perspective, centers the lives of over 100 women. And when I interviewed them, they were aged 17 to 50-something. My eldest graffiti girl wouldn't tell me how old she was. So these are women who write hip-hop graffiti in 23 different countries around the world. And I examine how they navigate their belonging and their presence in a heterosexist subculture. And ultimately, what I argue in the book is that feminism emerges through their performance, through how they perform their belonging, how they perform their presence, how they navigate their place within the subculture, the strategies that they use, that we can see feminism or feminist performance in terms of collectivity, empowerment, joy, pleasure, bodily autonomy, different way of thinking through how social justice might look, how equity might be attained within communities, those kinds of things.
What got you interested in graffiti art?
So this is interesting. I write about it in the introduction because it is very much part of the methodology of it. So I grew up in Dorchester, which is a city of Boston. All of my friends were graffiti writers. And I should say that all of my guy friends, were graffiti writers. And I actually was kind of annoyed by it. I didn't really enjoy graffiti at all because it was I felt like it was the only thing we did. It wasn't until graduate school when I was taking a class on lesbian art in America that I started thinking through all the absences of women in the world of high art and how that might relate to women's absences in subcultures, or low art, depending on how you're framing it. And so, thinking through how women in galleries, museums, art history, etc., are marginalized, tokenized, sexualized, those kinds of things. I just realized one day in class, I don't know any women who write graffiti, which seems absurd to me, again, because I was embedded, right, in the culture in Boston because of my friends. And I just said to myself, well, there are women in art history, in fine art, so surely there are women who write graffiti. So it was less that the graffiti interested me and more that the notable absence of women in the subculture that sparked my interest and really launched this project.
One of the things that you talk about in the book is the kind of increasing public visibility as well as kind of ongoing visibility within feminist subcultures in particular of women graffiti artists. Where do you see women's or feminist graffiti art going maybe in the next couple years?
The primary thing that I'm seeing right now that I'm wondering, how street artists and writers are going to navigate this is the bifurcation actually of street art and what I focus on, which is hip hop graffiti. So right now in what we would consider like creative cities, so cities that are hubs, major metropolitan areas that use creative arts to like bring in tourists, for example. One of the things that we're seeing is that writers of color, people who do hip hop graffiti as opposed to street art are actually being, once again, sort of passed over in this process of institutionalization where a community board might say, ooh, let's like have a street art day and hire people to paint on walls and give them permission, but it has to be family friendly, it has to be respectable, et cetera, et cetera. And street art and hip hop graffiti are different, but in terms of both of them being illegal or illicit, there are ways that they become commodified and commercialized and institutionalized that further exacerbate the problem or the reason why the writers are writing on walls in the first place. So that's one thing that I think about a lot, and especially in terms of the world of social media, which has drastically changed, again, the sort of illegal, the risks, the publicity, or even the anonymity, right? Especially when we're talking about hip hop graffiti, it's all about, you do an alternative name, you get it up as much as possible. You're supposed to be public, but you're supposed to be anonymous at the same time. And now you can log into Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and see graffiti attached to a name that is probably traceable. There are a lot of those kinds of shifts happening where the dynamic between like public and private for graffiti writers and street artists is really sort of up in the air and in question. And I don't really know how the subculture is going to kind of plot that out, how they're gonna navigate that. The more public you are, the more likely you are to like get hired, right? Or have your work be in a museum or something like that. But at the same time, it can also put you at risk for getting arrested, and who's going to get arrested and who's going to get hired. That's really the dynamic that I'm thinking about. And that's not specific to like feminist graffiti art or feminist street art. That's just specific to like street art in general. In terms of feminist graffiti art or women, I'm seeing a move toward feminism, which is really interesting because one of the things that I write about in my book is actually that they reject feminism, right? That when I was doing my research, a majority of the women that I spoke to related feminism to, this kind of global north, neoliberal, capitalist, empty girl power kind of ethic that they wanted nothing to do with. But I think because of the public discourse around Me Too, the women's marches, the legalization of abortion in Ireland, like those kinds of very public, widely circulated on social media, I'm seeing more graffiti writers claim it, articulate feminism in a different way than they did before. So that's exciting to me. I mean, I also had one of the graffiti girls, she's, I want to say she's in her 40s. She's in New Zealand, and she messaged me on Instagram and was like, I want to post something about feminism. I'm really coming around to it. I think I understand it better now. Can you like look at this and tell me what you think? I know that, you're really into feminism. That's your thing. Because, when I interview these girls, I ask them, what is your positionality on feminism? But their answer didn't mean that, like, if they said, no, I'm not a feminist, they weren't going in the book, right? The book would be empty in that case. So I just responded to her and just did the like affirmation work of, from my perspective, you've always been doing feminist work and articulating how what you do is feminist. You know, in her sense, she's the founder of the crew Stick Up Girls. In doing that work, you have been doing feminism. You've been articulating it in a different way, right? Aesthetically, rather than maybe linguistically. So I would love to see more queer feminist street art being celebrated, and anything that like takes us away from just like the same story about Banksy would make me happy.
Seems much overdue.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm curious how you see your work on this area of your research, but your other projects, which I hope we can get to more in a minute. How do you see your work combining academia, your interest in art or creativity, and your commitment to social justice?
Art, activism, and academia have never been separated for me. Just a little bit of background. I grew up raised by a single mom, working class, Puerto Rican household in Boston. Academia was never really on my radar. I kind of accidentally landed in my undergraduate program. That's a whole other story. But, my mom we didn't go to museums. We didn't go to plays. We had, Puerto Rican cultural art stuff, exposure to that kind of thing, artesana, like those kind of like craft things. My parents were not activists. Nobody in my family was an activist. So all three of those things I was exposed to in college. I did my undergraduate degree in sculpture and was kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing here. What am I doing? It seems like a cool idea to do art, so let's do art. And my sculpture was terrible. It was awful until I discovered feminism. Until there was content behind the creation, for me, it didn't really gel or make sense. And then I got a work study gig at the Women's Resource Center, and that's how it all sort of came together. So my artivism, my activism, my art, and my academic self all emerged together. So I've never been able to like see them as separate. That said, I've learned over the years that academia cannot be the only place for the expression of those things, that my scholarly work needs to be accessible to the public. And though I don't make art anymore, I use my privilege as best I can to uplift the art making of other people who I admire, and then, try to be as available to my community as possible for activism work.
So you brought up uplifting the artwork of others and increasing a platform for artists and creators of various sorts to kind of get their name and get their work out there. And I'd love to turn to the work you do with curation, because it's something that has shown up across a lot of the interviews that I've done on this podcast. Certainly the podcast itself, I think of as a curation project. And I'm curious what you find so appealing or maybe energizing about a feminist or queer or racial justice approach to arts curating.
This is something that I've actually just realized kind of recently through being, a professor on the tenure track, being one of very few women of color on a predominantly white campus. I consider myself a network builder, a community builder. That's very important to me. I think the best work is done collectively and through collaboration. So that's where the excitement comes in terms of curation, because what is curating? Curating is bringing together in some kind of space or in some kind of conversation, people, objects, ideas that strengthen and challenge the collective enterprise. In relation to my work with graffiti girls, the interest was not necessarily the medium. The interest was, how can I intervene in the absence of women in graffiti studies, in graffiti subculture? It was an activist, social justice oriented impetus. Right. And the very first thing I did was bring girls down to Arizona from New York City to collectively paint on a wall, to show people that not only were women painting graffiti, but they were doing it together, and look at their different styles, and the fact that they're still able to work together to figure out how to plat out the space on the wall, like all the logistical and aesthetic differences between how they work and what they produce. That to me that's the exciting part. Like, what do we learn when we bring a bunch of different women together to do something that makes them visible? I wrote a piece, writing break-in, beatboxing. It's about performing women in hip-hop culture, and it's in Signs. Because I was seeing all this backlash about curating all women's group shows. And this is the work that I was doing primarily with graffiti girls, right? It was always and only about women, and unapologetically so. And so I wrote this essay and I focused on beatboxing, graffiti writing, and breakdancing to argue that like we're not past the time where we need to do these kinds of curation projects. Some of the graffiti girls that did not want to be in my book said that my book would ghettoize them by putting them together only with other women. And this is the response you would get as a curator if you were trying to do a group show. Likely somebody would say, but why is it all women? I try to make the case that the curating work is making sure that they're not separatist spaces, having an all-girl event in hip-hop where they're the show, where they're the primary people on stage with the mic, but allowing anybody to come in and learn from them and be exposed to various kinds of hip-hop through women. I just think we're nowhere near a place where that kind of work has to stop. And so yeah, I went off on a tangent here because the thing that's exciting about curating is also the thing that's the most difficult about it. It's getting people to sort of understand why you're bringing them together and the sort of the rationalization around it.
What kind of projects are you working on these days?
So now I am doing something that maybe isn't the best thing for academics in the publisher parish hyper productivity culture that is academia. I'm taking a breath. I am allowing graffiti girls to sit in the sun, doing podcasts, going on book tour, talking to as many people as possible about the project. I mean, it took 15 years to produce, so I figure I should give it some time to land and make an impact, but also to give myself time to land. You know, I was at NWSA in November, the National Women's Studies Association, and someone came over to the booth during my book signing and was like, wow, you had a book and a baby at the same time. And I was like, yeah, I did. Right. So I have been in this job for 4 years and my child is 4 years old. I came into it pregnant. And so, you know, not only did I sort of bring a life into this world and, well, two lives really, into this world, but all of that sort of academic momming has taken a toll and I need a break. So I'm taking it. That said, I am, of course, also working on stuff. But my primary goal is to make sure that I'm like healthy and happy and being present. But I do have another book project on the horizon. It's called Performing Beyond. And it's a critical autoethnography about being diasporican, right? So what does it mean to be Puerto Rican living in the diaspora? And that book is being joined with these like little side project essays and articles that are coming out of activism. So when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, I launched a campaign called Feminists for Puerto Rico. It's really just a visibility and fundraising campaign. I designed a logo. I got people on board. We have a Facebook page. Sometimes we do Twitter, like information, kind of did you know campaigns, trying to get people to really understand that the crisis in Puerto Rico, the ongoing colonial condition of Puerto Ricans is a feminist issue, has been the thing that's predominantly taking my time right now, aside from the resting and the breathing and the just like hanging out with graffiti girls. But it's been great because through this second project, I'm really building a new network, you know, starting this Feminists for Puerto Rico. And I have another project that I'm working on collaboratively called Diasporicans, Decolonizing Academia. I have been exposed to a world of Puerto Rican scholars that I didn't know previously. And so I'm building a new community, another network through which to do my activism and my scholarly work. It's been really fulfilling.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite and final question that I get to ask folks, which really gets at the heart of why you do the work that you do in the world. And that's that better world that you're working towards, that world that you're imagining, that you're collectively producing with other artists, with other academics, with activists. So I'll ask you this giant question, which for some people is a scary question, but I think it's a really important question. What's the world that you want?
It is a giant question. I'm going to defer to my 4-year-old son. So, because lately he has been trying to distinguish between, I guess it must be a developmental thing, right? He's trying to distinguish between cartoons, movies, and like real life, quote unquote. And so he'll say, Mommy, is this in our world? Is this in this world? Can we have this in this world? Like he asks questions about what he's receiving in the frame of like, what world are we in? Which is really interesting to me. I think if I can rephrase the question of like, maybe not what I want the world to look like, but what I want to be included in the world that I live in, it would be things like a world where people have equitable access to not just the like material substances that we need, right? Food, shelter, water, clothing, but also things like joy and the freedom to express yourself sexually and gender-wise, to have sovereignty, to not have land taken. I would really like to see a world where an independent Puerto Rican nation free of colonial debt was a reality. I would like to live in a world where I don't have to talk to my son every day about, because he's gender fluid and it gets questioned and challenged a lot. You know, why are you wearing a skirt? So I would love to live in a world where I don't have to teach him how to navigate those kinds of questions and challenges, where he can just, you know, have his dinosaur and wear his tutu at the same time and not be challenged or tried to be like fit back into a box by the people in his life. So, and I want to just bring this back to graffiti for a second, because the things that I want in my world, they're raw and they're not necessarily respectable. They're rebellious. They're non-normative. There's a writer named Claw Money who said something to me at a book signing. She said, "Thank God for graffiti, because it reminds us that we're free and that we don't have to obey their rules. The world that I want to live in can be the world I'm already living in. There are already other worlds happening. We just have to support them. They're already in existence."
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing all of the creative ways that you imagine otherwise.
Thank you so much. I hope that this was as fun for you as it was for me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Persad, Rebecca Reynolds, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.